I hope everyone had a great break. Welcome back. And let's go ahead and get into Module 5, where we're going to really look at a lot of great tools around migration, but we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about Azure Active Directory and how we migrate and how we have a hybrid directory services and where we can get to single sign-on. So let's go ahead and get started with Module 5. So let's hop right in and talk about how to protect, manage, monitor, and optimize workloads. And really, our conversation, once again, with Smart Hotels is going to talk about directory. Why are we talking about identity? Well, one of the first layers of defense is protecting your users and getting them synchronized. So we're going to talk about how do we take that on-prem Active Directory domain services and we synchronize it with Azure Active Directory, and what kind of advantages does it give us as an organization, and what are some choices that we have when we're connecting that. But we also have the ability to put domain controllers directly in Azure on virtual machines. So it really depends on your needs of what you want to do with identity. In my personal opinion, I think if you're really not seriously looking at leveraging Azure Active Directory as your primary identity source in your organizations, you're missing kind of a lot of advantages that Azure AD can provide for you, especially with some of the services we'll end towards the end of the module where we'll talk about, and this is a bit of a mouthful, Azure Active Directory Domain Services, AADDS for short. I know it's a lot, but it's if you need those domain services in Azure, we can leverage some nice services to make that happen where you may not have to bring that whole kind of on-prem domain controller infrastructure on board. But let's just talk briefly about that. We can put Active Directory domain services into virtual machines, into the IaaS side of Azure Active Directory. All we have to do is make sure that our on-prem network is connected to Azure, either using a site-to-site VPN or ExpressRoute. And once that connection's set up, then we simply install virtual machines running Windows, and then we install our domain controllers, and they'll synchronize just like they would if they were on-prem. Now, why do we do this? What are some things that we want to do? We can get our custom GPOs, we get some schema extensions, we custom AD partitions. Now, with group policy objects, they're important, especially from an on-prem environment. They're our number one management tool, really from an IT perspective. We have a lot of things in Azure that can replace the need for GPO, and even to some extent, we do have group policy objects with AADDS, and we'll talk about that towards the end. But when I look at schema extensions and I look at AD partitions, generally it indicates you have applications. Once again, you want to kind of consider, do we really need those apps anymore, or can we leverage the domain services that we have in Azure to make that happen? But when you do this, and this is a big drawback, you're putting a domain controller on a virtual machine inside of Azure, which means not only do you have to install and configure it and pay for it, you now have to have that VM up and running and making sure everything's connected with the network, and we're synchronizing kind of the same problems that we have with Active Directory domain services on-prem. We're just putting it in the cloud. So I'm not a huge fan of this. It does have its merit, especially if you have applications that need that requirements. And this is kind of what it looks like from an architectural perspective, where we have our on-prem network connected, probably through some kind of gateway technology, maybe a jump box that you might have. We have our application subnet that's making requests to those domain services. Primarily, when I see customers do this, it's not necessarily for the identity. It's more so for the actual applications where they might need a Kerberos authentication. But I'll tell you what, folks, there's a better alternative that you don't have to use IaaS. Not that it's not a valid solution, but we can do some cost optimization. That's what we're going to talk about kind of towards the end of this module. Now, just like running domain controllers, whether they're in the same force or different force, we have that same drawback. We have to manage the VMs, we have to pay for IaaS, we have to manage all those systems that are there. Architecturally, it doesn't look too different. However, now we have that trust relationship between our on-prem network and our on-prem domain services to the domain controllers running inside of Azure. But if you think about this, folks, if you're doing this today on-prem, it's really not much different. The only difference is where those virtual machines are running. In this case, they happen to be running inside of Azure. So we can basically deploy Active Directory domain services via Azure VMs. But I think the drawback of having that entire environment and having virtual machines and managing those Windows servers really is prohibitive. And once again, it's really for the applications that may need those services. But we're going to learn later there's a better alternative for us as we go through this. And really, that better alternative starts with Azure Active Directory. This is our cloud-based directory service. It's a fairly flat service. It has users and groups and our devices and our systems that are there. But it's where we have our identity solution. The great thing about Azure Active Directory is that it's a centralized environment. It's a centralized directory service where we have our user IDs and passwords. Now, you might hear this term AAD tenant or Azure Active Directory tenant. And that's kind of a bit of a misnomer because the tenant is a separate construct inside of our Microsoft Cloud services. The tenant does contain Azure Active Directory as well as some other services that are tenant-wide settings and things that we can do for configuration, some security settings under there. But for the most part, whenever I think about tenant, this is where Azure Active Directory lives. And whenever you work with the tenant, you can have multiple directories inside that tenant. The key thing here, though, is when you have those directories, you're going to tie them to a subscription of some sort. That might be an Azure subscription, that might be a Microsoft 365 or Office 365 subscription, or that might be a Dynamics or D365 subscription. The tenants simply provide, or I should say the tenants include Azure Active Directory that provides our authentication mechanism to get us into our subscriptions. And each subscription has its own authorization mechanisms, and we'll talk a bit about those later. Whenever you create a tenant in a directory scheme inside of Azure, you're going to get a default name that ends with onmicrosoft.com. So if your company's foo, you'd be foo.onmicrosoft.com. At Microsoft, I would imagine we started probably Microsoft.onmicrosoft.com, although I don't know for certain. But the great thing about this, you can customize it to whatever your domain name is. If you, for example, if you send me an email, it's at my end is Microsoft.com. Why? Well, because we have a custom domain name because we own that. You don't have to worry about somebody stealing your domain names because they do have to have a verification. And the only way they can do that is they have official access to your DNS database and registrar information, which they won't. And so we can create custom domain names so we can work with that. Very easy to verify that. But Azure Active Directory is our primary environment. We don't have domain controllers. There's not a concept of that. It's a cloud service that we can leverage. No replication between our cloud regions. Now, everybody's like, well, that's a big deal. Understand that this is a global service. So when you have Azure Active Directory, you have a service in place that was most likely created when you installed your tenant. And I'm willing to bet most of you, when you install Microsoft 365 or Office 365, you already have Azure Active Directory. It'll be your country of origin. So if you're in the United States, it'll be in the U.S. If you're around the world, you'll be in one of the worlds that are there. But there's really no need for that replication because it lives where it lives, right? And it's a part of your environment. So Azure Active Directory has no organizational units. It's a completely flat structure. I would argue we don't need organizational units in Azure Active Directory because we have this concept in our Azure subscriptions called resource groups that provides that structure. If you think about OUs, it was about organizing resources generally for authorization purposes. So I could allow the things or devices or users or groups in the OUs to go do something in my environment. Well, we use resource groups for that. So not a full replacement, but I don't know if you really need OUs anymore inside of Azure Active Directory. Now, when you have Azure Active Directory in your corner, you have an incredible identity service, a very secure identity service, even more secure than what we have on-prem. Well, you're thinking, well, Matt, I have Azure Active Directory because we have Office 365. And by the way, I say that a lot, even though we're in an Azure class, because most of you started with Microsoft 365 or Office 365. And whether you knew it or not, you had Azure Active Directory behind you. It was always providing those identity services that you logged in and authenticated with Azure Active Directory, and then you were authorized to go do things in your Microsoft 365 subscription, like, get email or look at a SharePoint site. With Azure, we follow the same thing, but we use what is called role-based access for authorization. We'll talk a bit about that in a bit. But the cool thing about this, synchronizing this directory services. If I have users and groups on-prem, how do I move them into Azure? We have a fantastic little tool called Azure AD Connect, and we're going to see that tool today, just so you can see what it looks like. We're going to go through some of the configuration. It's a great tool. It synchronizes the directory services. It'll bring up all the properties and the users and whatever we tell it to bring up into those environments. And once we synchronize from on-prem services into Azure Active Directory, we now have an object inside of Azure Active Directory. Now, think about this. Once I'm in Azure Active Directory, and I don't care if it's a user you built in Azure Active Directory, in other words, it wasn't synchronized, a user we synchronized from on-prem, or guest accounts you may have invited to Azure Active Directory, once they're in the cloud directory services, they can take advantage of single sign-on. They can take advantage of multi-factor authentication for log on. And I'm telling you what, folks, if you're not doing MFA today, you need to seriously consider doing it. And it's not even, I wouldn't even say seriously consider it, just do it. You need to do this environment environment because we have to move away from passwords. It has been proven that passwords aren't as secure anymore, but MFA, adding that additional authentication mechanism of, something something you have, or something you are, is vital to this. We even have self-service password reset capabilities. Azure Active Directory has this stuff built in. If you think about how did I do it on-prem? How did you do MFA on-prem? You might have had a third-party tool you had to install. You might have had to do a lot of configuration to make it happen. It's native to Azure Active Directory. This is a huge advantage of what we can do. And the minute those users are synced from on-prem into Azure Active Directory, they now become a cloud object and they can take advantage of all those fantastic abilities. When we synchronize users, and I'm going to show this to you where it is in our configuration in just a moment, we have a couple of choices of how we let our users and who authenticates our users. First one is called password hash synchronization. And so what happens here when we run AD Connect, and this is a configuration option, I'll show you where it is. We synchronize a user from on-prem and their password, and we pass it into Azure Active Directory. We take that full user object. And so now when that user logs on, they're fully authenticated by Azure Active Directory. Why? Both their username and their password are stored there. Now, when I first talk to customers about this, they go, whoa, wait a second, Matt. You mean I'm sending my password across the wire into Azure Active Directory? Yeah, you are. But you're doing it in a very secure fashion. We actually take the password that's on-prem, we apply a hash algorithm to it, and we hash that hash. In other words, it's an incredibly secure password that's being passed to Azure Active Directory, and it's being stored in a similar fashion as well. The point being, compared to what we do on-prem and how we store those passwords and how they're encrypted and kept secret, in transit, believe it or not, they're actually more secure. And so now we have that functionality and we have a very secure password. So now users can take advantage of just logging into the cloud natively for whatever they're going to do. And because we have single sign-on experience capabilities, now they can take that same identity, and if they have permissions to on-prem or into cloud services, they log in once and they're good to go for wherever their resources are for whatever they're going to use. So password hash sync, very common mechanism for working with our passwords. The other option that we have is what is called pass-through authentication, or PTA. Now with PTA, we sync the user object into Azure Active Directory, but we don't sync the actual password. The password still lives on-prem inside of Active Directory domain services. Now, when you look at this, you're going to be inclined to think that when a user logs on, they're going to be authenticated by on-prem Active Directory domain services. The fact of the matter, they are not. Even though the password's there, the authentication will still be completed inside of Azure Active Directory. Here's what happens. When that user logs on that has been synchronized with pass-through authentication, they provide that username and password to Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory takes the password and through an agent that's running on-prem, verifies that password. And once that password is verified, it simply sends back an acknowledgement back to Azure Active Directory saying that is the correct password. And then Azure AD finishes the authentication process. And so the great thing about pass-through authentication is the authentication still occurs inside of Azure Active Directory, but you have not synchronized the passwords. The one downside, or the potential downside to this, is if I can't talk to the on-prem domain services. What if your site-to-site VPN or your express route or the connection's down, those users won't be able to log on. So there's a huge advantage to have password hash synchronization running, because when we're running the hash, we don't have to worry about that connectivity to that on-prem environment. So pass-through authentication is another very popular method for this and how users log on, but it's one of the two choices that we have. And you'll pick one or the other as you come into that environment. Regardless of which environment you have, with a check, you can set up SSO, or seamless single sign-on. And what this allows me to do is that one user ID that I log on with, no matter where they are, will have access to both Azure environments and on-prem environments as well. They're going to basically have that seamless single, and literally it's a check of a box. So now no matter where that user logs on, no matter where the resources are at, they need to have access to, guess what? They can do so very, very easily with seamless single sign-on. So it works really, really well inside of our environments, and it's native. Okay. Now, how does this architecture work? It's actually quite easy. We install, and I'll take you through these steps as well. We basically install an agent on our on-prem environments, specifically on the domain controllers, that does that synchronization for us. And that agent talks directly to Azure Active Directory, and it will synchronize periodically. Now, today we're going to try to get the synchronization to occur hopefully immediately, and we can force it. Although generally in real life, once you get the connection set up, the synchronization period is going to be fairly quick. But I'm going to try to force it a little bit, and hopefully we'll see some magic as those users and properties of those users are being synchronized to Azure Active Directory. And once we're inside of Azure Active Directory, now whatever apps we have to rely on that we can use for that user are going to be ability to just, we sign in, and now we're going to be able to do it as long as we're authorized to do that. So we've been talking a lot about Azure AD and Connect, and that we're just logging on. Just one key thing I want to point out here. Whenever you talk about log on, you're talking about authentication, proving who you are. And especially today, as I mentioned before, you're going to use MFA to doubly prove who you are. But we have this other concept called authorization. And when you look at this architecture slide, right in that middle with the AD sync, that's where authentication is occurring. Now, if that user who is authenticated is authorized, they'll be able to run the app and do whatever they want to make our architecture work. But the great thing about once AD Connect is in place and that user logs on, now they're good to go, especially if you have single sign-on set up inside of it. So let's take a look at Azure Active Directory Connect, and we're going to kind of break this environment up into two things. We're going to take a look at what's up in the cloud, and then we're going to take a look at what's happening on our domain controller on-prem. A little bit opening the hood here. My domain controller is running on a VM inside of Azure. I just have a single VM, and I know what you're saying. Well, Matt, you said that's not something you want to do. Well, let me qualify. And I didn't say it wasn't something you do, something you should consider finding an alternative. But I only have a domain controller. I didn't want to install something local on my system. I just wanted something that pre-canned inside of Azure, just for demonstration purposes. So when you see the VM, you're going, Matt, you said don't do that. Well, that's my only domain controller, and it's for the purpose of showing you AD Connect. So give me a little bit of grace. So let's hop in and let's take a look at our environment. So let me hop over to my portal here. And here I am in one of my portals. Now, one thing I want to point out, you'll say, wait a second, Matt, you don't have Azure. You have this screen up and running and ready for us to go. It is. This is just a directory. This is just where my user identities are stored. But if you'll notice these three tiles, start a trial or access student benefits, I don't actually have a subscription tied to this particular directory. This is just a directory. So there's nothing, I'll set up authentication, but there's nothing there that I'm going to be able to authenticate to. I just have a centralized directory. Now, some of you might see this today in your environments. And well, Matt, we have Office 365. Well, if you think about where I'm at, I'm in the Azure portal. So I don't have an Azure subscription, but you still might have a Microsoft 365 subscription. And you can manage your Azure Active Directory this way, although there's other dedicated tools. So let me hop into Azure Active Directory. And in Azure AD, I have my ability to look at my different users that I have. I have synchronized. I have a couple users that are synced here. And how do I know they're synced? You can see it says directory synchronized. So whenever that bit says yes, guess what? This is Azure's way of saying they came from Active Directory domain services or on-prem directory for us to work with it. But then we see these other users that say, no, they're not synced, but they're enabled. These are cloud users that are inside of our environment. So these users only live in one place, Azure Active Directory. And we can even add in new guest users. So if you want to bring somebody in from a different company or a different logon, you can bring them in here. Now, just a note, when you bring in the guest users, their authentication is done completely by whoever their provider is. So if you bring in somebody from, MSN.com, and that's a guest account, or Yahoo.com, or one of the other different sites, their authentication is actually going to be completed by whoever their identity provider is, wherever that guest account comes from. But we have three primary objects from a user perspective inside of Azure. Again, once they're here in Azure Active Directory, we can do things like MFA. You can see it right here. Very easy to set up. We're not going to get into that conversation. I could spend the next 6 hours talking about authentication, but it's there. We're here to talk about Active Directory Sync. So I'm going to scroll down. When you have your Azure Active Directory environment, you'll have an option in the blades to manage it. It's called Azure AD Connect. And you'll notice that I've already set it up, that Azure AD Connect has already been enabled. It's been configured, and it's ready for me to go inside of Azure. I set this up just ahead of time because it takes just a little bit of time to set it up, but don't worry. I'm going to show you the full configuration. I'm even going to run the tools configuration so you can see what's happening under the covers. But once we set this up, we can see kind of some options. What kind of sign-ins do we have? Notice we have password hash sync. We don't have PTA. We didn't enable seamless single sign-on, and I just did that because I really don't need it to be enabled. I'm not really accessing resources. In most organizations, you're going to check that box to enable seamless sign-on when you configure this particular tool. Now, what am I actually working with and configured to? I have a little VM here, and in this VM, for those of you, hey, I miss my Active Directory users and computers, I actually have it here. Now, officially, we recommend using the Active Directory Administrative Center. I don't know. I'm a little old school. I grew up with this tool, so I just love this tool to death. And I can look at the different users that are here. So if I come in, I can see the properties of this user and kind of make sure you know that I'm not cheating here. If I look at AD user 1 in the organization, currently the organization is marketing. And if I go here and I look at my AAD user 1, that's here, you'll see that this department is marketing. If everything goes right, we're going to change that. We're going to put user 1 into the IT department, and hopefully we'll see that change. And we're going to add a user as part of this demo as well. But I want to kind of show you a before and after picture, and because I love technology, folks. When things just change all of a sudden and things are working, it always makes me feel like it's magic, all right? So I'm going to change user 1. I'm going to make it IT. Now, I could wait for synchronization. I'm not going to, but I'm also going to do something else. I'm going to add in a new user here. We're just going to call it Mark. And Mark is my producer sitting on the other side, having to listen to me drone on for several days. So I'm just going to make him immortalize him here in my demo today. And so we'll have a little bit of fun with my producers. He's probably looking at me in the screen right now going, "What are you doing?" I'm having fun. And let me get this information in. Let me get the password in. And I'm going to say password never expires because I don't want it to change. Oops. I actually got to type them in so they do match. And go ahead and finish it. So I've added a user. Now, once again, that user doesn't exist yet up into my environment. If I go to my user accounts, now the one time I did do this demo, I happened to catch right when the sync occurred, so it did show up right away. And even if I look at AD user 1, I'll probably still see the marketing and not the IT department. Now, there's lots of ways we can synchronize this account up. We have several tools to use that. I could use our Active Directory synchronization server and run our connectors for both the adatum.com, which is this on-prem environment, and the sync domain. I could simply right-click and say, let's run a full synchronization to make that occur. We could do it via PowerShell if we wanted to as well. There's a lot of synchronization services. Now, I'm not going to use either one of those methods because I'm going to show you the AD Connect tool and where all of this stuff is configured to set up our environment. So let me hop out and minimize my windows here, and let me hop into Azure AD Connect. Now, this tool has already been installed and configured, so when you come into this, it's going to ask you what do you want to configure inside the option, inside the tool. So I can change a lot of different options that are here. I'm just going to go with customized synchronization options because I want to change some of those options that are here. So I'm going to go into next here. It's going to ask me to log on. And you notice the address here, Adatum Sync AD Connect on Microsoft.com. That's the domain inside of Azure. It's asking which directory do I want. That's my directory, adatum.com. And it's going to ask, what am I synchronizing? Now, in this particular environment, I'm just syncing the to-sync OU on-prem, and that's where those users live. They live in the to-sync OU. So I'm just synchronizing that. I'm not synchronizing everybody. And oh, by the way, when you do this, you're not going to synchronize everybody either. If you think about it, you have your local service accounts, your local administrators. You don't want to synchronize those accounts inside of Azure. Why? You don't need them. You don't need them inside the environment for us to work with. And when I go to next, this is where a lot of your options are available for you to configure. Now, I have some Exchange things here that are grayed out. Why? Because I don't have Exchange installed, and it hasn't modified my Active Directory domain services schema. If I did, those options would be checked to allow that. Where we have our big options here is password hash synchronization. I also have password write back for me to work with as well. I'd have to reconfigure the tool to get password pass-through authentication. This was my initial configuration, which would be easy to change if I wanted to. I'm going to leave that option up and running. I'm going to go ahead and click on next. It's going to make sure everything's installed, it's properly configured. And this is actually what the end of the install looks like. But the actual configuration takes quite a bit longer than what we're doing here. So pretty much installing the tool and configuring it just like what we did now. It's going to ask me, do I want to start? I'm going to go ahead and say, let's go ahead and configure that option. And it should work with the synchronization services that are running right now. We'll give this a second to run. We also have a health agent that's available for Premier, or I should say Premium Azure Active Directory, that does a health monitoring of the connection to make sure everything's working properly inside of it. Even though I don't have it, it's still checking it. So this will take a second to get by. Now it looks like it's all run. Configuration complete. We did the synchronizing has been initiated. If I exit that, I should see a couple options here in just a minute. And if I look at my synchronization service to verify everything executed, you'll see some additional activities here that an export currently is in progress, a Delta synchronization's there. So we're seeing that stuff is occurring inside my actual environment. Hopefully here in a moment, those will all clear out and they're successful. So I know the synchronization server ran under the covers for me to look at. And if I minimize this, if I go back to users here, I should now see my marked user eventually. It should come over here. It did run just a minute ago, so it may not be quite ready yet. And notice the department's already changed the IT. Mark will probably show up here in just a moment. Sometimes with Azure Active Directory, it just takes a quick refresh, and eventually that user will sync. There it is. My Mark, the producer, has now been synchronized from on-prem. And so I run those tools just to kind of force that synchronization, but that's a little bit of magic. Change something on-prem, and it works inside of Azure Active Directory. But that's AD Connect. And by the way, I've been around Azure long enough. We usually have some old tools called directory synchronization. They weren't nearly as easy to configure. They did work, but the synchronization timing was really weird of how it's set up and synchronized. I will tell you the AD Connect tool is just simply fabulous. It makes our lives so much easier when we're synchronizing and working with that. So that's AD Connect. That's the power of AD Connect and how we can leverage synchronization of our users. So let's go ahead and hop back in and kind of talk about some other services that we have inside of Azure. And really one of the big ones is Azure Active Directory Domain Services, or AADDS. This is how we can kind of make Azure Active Directory think that it's a domain controller. And notice the key word, kinda. It's not a full domain control, but it allows me to essentially provide some capabilities. And when I show you the installation of the services here in a moment, you'll see what I mean. And I'm going to stop the installation after I get to one screen, because the only time you'll ever really do this is when you need applications that need Azure domain services types of things, or I shouldn't say Azure, Active Directory domain service types of things like Kerberos. You have an app that only speaks Kerberos. Azure AD doesn't speak Kerberos or LDAP. It uses REST APIs. It uses OAuth. It has a lot of cloud-based environments, which makes it very friendly, by the way, Azure Active Directory, that is, with other cloud environments. I don't know if you know this, and you might be surprised to find out, you can use Azure Active Directory to provide authentication for, I don't know, let me think, your Amazon Web Services, your Google Cloud, for Salesforce, even for Facebook. There's thousands of apps that we can actually, Azure AD can be your identity platform for. So we have some nice things with Azure Domain Services, but they really provide that kind of Kerberos. The main reason you'll do this is for applications, not really the users. You want to leverage Azure Active Directory for users. It's a much better directory service than what we've ever had, especially if you've used Microsoft technologies. But you might have apps that need that domain controller, that need that domain controller environment, that kind of that touchy-feel environment to make them work properly inside of Azure. So let me just show you what that is. Just a real quick demo here to take a look at the Azure Active Directory domain services. So let me hop back into my portal here. I'm going to go up to my home here, and I can go home and find it because I have it set up from earlier, or I can just simply go Azure Active Directory domain services. So there it is, Azure AD Domain Services. By the way, real good article here that talks about all the advantages of this, why people use it. Once again, it's mainly for those domains. You actually see the same graphic that I had in my slides. They're inside of it. So let me go ahead and go back to my environment. Let me bring this up. And I'm going to go ahead. Oh, and actually, because I don't have a subscription, this is where when I'm using my trial accounts, I can't do it here. The reason I can't, because it does install some services in the subscription. So there is some cost to the domain services here. So let me switch over to my other directory very quick. And let me just go back to the one that actually has my environment. And let me go into my Active Directory domain services here. You'll notice now the experience is, hey, you can create these. So let me just go ahead and show you what this looks like. And I'll just put it in a resource group. Doesn't really matter where. You have different SKUs for how they work with it. All depends on the applications and capacity of what you want to choose. I'm just going to leave it on a single, just a user forest. I'm going to let it create its own networks. I can have global admins of the Azure AD directory and bring those notifications forward. And I can even have domain controller administrators here set up for us to work with it. If we want synchronization with our domain services, in other words, if we have an application that needs to access some kind of account with Azure Active Directory, we can set up that synchronization. We can control what is actually being synchronized to the domain services. But really the crux of the tool is, and the main reason why you do this is what authentication options. Do we support NTLM 1 for authentication or TLS 1.2? Those are application security metrics. So if you have apps that still require that, by the way, I would seriously consider updating those apps. Those are relatively older security modules that we have. Do we want password synchronization for those on-prem environments as well as this? But the big one here is Kerberos. Do we need Kerberos for our applications to be able to talk to it? Some of your apps were written with Kerberos in mind, and if you need to do that inside of Azure Active Directory, you're going to have to use Azure AD Domain Services or AADDS, right? And it's an ability for us, and it basically puts us that layer, and it makes those applications think they are talking to a domain controller for all intents purposes, even though they're not. And they're like, hey, I need a DC. Azure AD pokes its head up and says, hey, I'm a DC. Come talk to me. And in reality, it's brokering that communication back with Azure Active Directory so that our application can talk and get authenticated and can do a variety of things for us inside of our Azure environment. So some really cool services here. One other small advantage, although it's not as full fidelity what we have with on-prem, but if you have Azure AD Domain Services in place, guess what? You now have some limited group policy capabilities as well. So if you miss group policy objects for server management, guess what? Azure Active Directory Domain Services has that for you as well. All right, so that's AADS, just a quick tour through that environment. But that's what we can do. Now, let's finish this module and let's switch out of Azure Active Directory for just a moment and let's talk about some of the other tools we have. Remember, whenever we're talking about doing migrations, what's our first thing? And I know what you're thinking. Matt hasn't said the word yet. Nope, I hadn't yet. Plan. You got to plan, right? And so when you plan, that's our first step. We do assessment, we do a discovery, we do migration. Now we're in Azure. What are some things that we can do to help us maintain our environment? And I bring up the slide called the Cloud Kill Chain Model. This is how, when you look at how people that might come in and do you harm, they're going to look for exposure. They're going to look for vulnerabilities. They're going to try to gain access. And once they get in, they're going to try to figure out where can they go. They're going to go lateral. They're going to just go across your environment. And eventually they're going to try to take data, maybe lose data. They're going to do something bad to your environment. This is how they think. Can I find something that's on the outside? Can I get into that? Can I move anywhere inside of it? And then can I do what I need to do? To steal information, to delete information, whatever they're going to try to do. Now, why do I tell you this? Because guess what? Microsoft has a tool that thinks like this. We have a tool called the Security Center that thinks like somebody that's trying to do you harm. But guess what? They have a white hat on. They're a good guy. They're trying to help you inside the environment. And Security Center's job is to think along that kill chain, to think about your environment. Why? To strengthen your security posture, to make sure you're not doing things like opening up the ports you're not supposed to, Or if they are open, how do we protect the resources that are there? We also, with Security Center, not only are we the white hat trying to find the stuff and let you know and inform you, we also have tools to help protect against those threats. We have a whole series of tools called Defender. And you've probably heard Windows Defender before, but we have different Defender services for the different workloads in Azure. We have Defender for storage. We have Defender for SQL Server. We have Defender for your VMs. We have a lot of tools here to protect your different workloads. And a lot of people ask me, says, well, Matt, why do we have so many different tools? The simple fact of the matter is a lot of you have third-party tools that you use to secure your environment. Folks, I love our tools, but I love you being more secure first. In other words, use those tools. But if you have a gap in tools, look at Security Center. We might have that environment and help you get that secure faster. Because the cool thing about Security Center, it's going to give you a score saying, hey, you need to consider this. It's going to give you advice. Follow the advice. It's even going to help you do things for compliancy. We have Security Center policies. Are you really HIPAA compliant? Are you ITAR compliant? It's going to look across your environment to make sure you're meeting some of those regulations as well. So it does a lot. The Security Center, it's a centralized service. It actually leverages the Azure Monitor service, specifically the log analytics workspaces, to provide you information inside of there. And it gathers all the information from possible agents that might be installed on our endpoints. They can be in other clouds, other SaaS applications. They could be on-prem. Azure Center just collects all this data and says, here you go. Here's where you have possible problems or issues or possible vulnerabilities. Now, we have another tool that goes hand in hand with Security Center, and that's Azure Sentinel. Sentinel's our security investigation tool, our SIEM and SOAR tool to help not only find the threats, but remediate against the threats. It's basically our attacking tool, essentially. It's going to counterattack, and it's doing it in real time because it's looking at the log analytic workspace to handle what's going on. So when you think about Microsoft, these two tools really change the game from a perspective of what we can do to protect your cloud workloads. We know a lot of you just hopped into the cloud. Well, have you thought about security? You need to, right? And we have two really good tools that are not only helping protect Azure, but they're cross-cloud platform friendly. Because we know a lot of our customers have multiple clouds. We now have a tool set that can help protect that entire infrastructure from a security perspective. So whenever I talk about these tools, and we have several classes we do just on security in general, the common thing I will tell the students and the learners that I meet in these classes, because of these two tools and a whole lot of other reasons, Microsoft's the largest security company you've never heard of. How many of you knew about Security Center, that you had a tool that's identifying? And by the way, Security Center is free. Now, if you want Defender, that has a cost, but just the assessment, finding out where you're vulnerable is 100% free. You might have third-party tools that do all that stuff for you. All right? Understand that it's free. Azure Security Center works with role-based access. So when we have a tool like Security Center that says, hey, here's our vulnerability, you want to control who can use that tool. And inside of Azure, we use this concept called role-based access to help control how we allow people in. And the concept is we have a user or a group, we assign them a role, and that role has permissions to do things. There are really two specific roles designed for Security Center. That's a security reader, and that's a security admin. The reader can just look at the information, and the admin can actually make modifications, help set things up. Whenever you set these roles up, look at the very bottom statement on this slide. Least permissive role. In other words, this is not for everybody, because these are roles and users that you really want to keep protected. Even their security reader. Wow, the security reader. Could you imagine if somebody got the security reader role that's not a part of your environment? They would see everything. They would see where all the holes are in your environment. So understand, lock these roles down. Only a handful of folks in your security environment should have access to these roles. And you should use things like dynamic group membership, which is a part of Azure Active Directory, that when that person leaves the security department and goes on to another role, they're automatically removed from the groups that have access to these roles. And it's very easy to do, actually, inside of Azure. We have Defender. Defender is one of those tools. It's been around for a while, and it's been evolving. But the great thing about Defender now is intelligence, is that it's based on artificial intelligence engines. And when you think about all the data that's out there, where all these bad folks are, and you think about the amount of data that we see on a daily basis at Microsoft, we have this ginormous database that we leverage for machine learning to educate our tools, not only from a performance and enhancement, but also from a security standpoint. Defender allows us to create that environment, allows us to set up alerts, even allows us to protect hybrid environments, non-Azure computers, VMs on-prem, VMs across other clouds. It generates all this alert for us, but also puts the shields up. Now, the one thing I love about Defender, because I have a lot of people think, well, hey, Matt, Windows Defender wasn't the best tool. That may have been several years ago. But there was a recent vulnerability, was Emotet was the name of it, and I can't remember, it's probably 3 or 4 years ago now, where Windows Defender systems saw it, analyzed it, fed it back up to Azure, and through artificial intelligence, they developed a patch. And within a half hour, essentially half hour, give or take, everybody that had Windows Defender with auto updates were automatically protected against Emotet. So when you look at modern security tools, they better be able to make those claims. They better be able to say, hey, look, we're based on artificial intelligence. Because nowadays, when you look at the security landscape, we live in an assumed breach model. You're going to get attacked, possibly even compromised. You have to think that way today. Have tools to help you protect when it does happen, not if, when it does happen. We don't want those things to happen, but you're on the internet, guess what? It's there. The best way, by the way, I always joke, what's the best way to secure a computer? Put it in cement, throw it in the ocean. You have zero functionality, but you have 100% security. Whenever you expose things, you got to make sure, how do we protect those things? Defender is one tool to do that. This is the dashboard for Defender. It shows you just a couple highlights here of all the different things, that we can protect from servers, your Kubernetes environment, container instances, app services, SQL, your key vault, your databases, your storage. We have Defender to protect those wide variety of resources that we'll have inside of Azure. It's not the only tool that we have, but we have lots of other security mechanisms inside of Azure. Defender is a great place to take a look at when we're talking about that secure and optimization phase of our migration. Azure Monitor feeds all of this. I could spend 5 hours talking about Monitor and all the different capabilities that are here. This one slide does a really good job of outlining it. If you look on the left, these are things that we can monitor with Azure Monitor. We can monitor your applications. We can monitor your infrastructure. We can monitor your platform services. We can even monitor custom sources we can bring in to this. And Azure Monitor breaks it into really the only two things that we care about when we're monitoring. We have our metrics, the what's happening. An example of a metric, you are at 95% CPU utilization. All right. And when you have those metrics that are outside of the norms, right, either too low or too high, what's happening? You're going to look at the log files. I like to call the log files the whys. So we know what's going on with the metrics. The log files are going to help us point into the why. Your job as somebody who's doing monitoring, it's probably the hardest job, is event correlation. How do I know that those two different services, okay, this error occurred in the metric, it went up to 90%, log file says, oh, people were logging on. You know, think about this. We have event correlation throughout everywhere you work on. Monday morning, you go into the office, you log on, why is the network slow? Event correlation, log files, everybody's logging in. Friday, why is my computer taking slow to log on? That might be running when you're in your backup environment. Now, fun little story on this real quick. I was working out of a friend's office one day and just hanging out. We were going to go to lunch later, so I was just chilling. I was sitting in his kitchen, in his little office, and I was doing work. And I had to be on a video call, and so I was video streaming and just talking with my friend. And all of a sudden, my buddy comes in and starts the microwave. And all of a sudden, I saw my video go, wow. I looked like Max Headroom, right? It's all broken up, pixelated. I wasn't fading away. I was dissolving. It was just really bad of how we work inside of the environment. Well, what was my event correlation? For those of you who don't know, and I learned this that day, microwaves run on 2.4 gig, and I was connected to my friend's 2.4 gig Wi-Fi. I switched over to the 5G, and it went away. Event correlation. I'd have never figured that out if the microwave hadn't turned on, right? Of course, it was fine until they did turn on the microwave that's there. Now, what kind of things do we get out of Monitor? Just a truckload of information. When we're looking at applications, we actually have a tool called App Insights. It does have some cost to this tool. The cool thing about it, whenever you think about troubleshooting and monitoring environments, some of you might have had this conversation, and there are two variations of this conversation. Variation one It's not my application, it's your infrastructure. Why everything's running slow. And the variation of, it's not my infrastructure, it's your app of what's causing slow. And we have our developers and IT pros blaming each other for why the app is slow. App insights will actually point to the line of code that's causing the latency in the app. Now, that's just the starting point. That very well could be a badly written piece of code, or that piece of code is calling a service somewhere else in Azure, and there's security that's blocking that line from doing its job. So it could be the infrastructure. App Insights just points you in the right location. We can tie into a lot of services. We can look at the different metrics. We have a Log Analytic Explorer. If you're going to use Log Analytics, just a tidbit, you're going to want to learn a language called Kusto or KQL. Do that type of work. We can visualize this in a wide variety of dashboards. Now, this last thing that we can do at the very bottom, when you have metrics and logs, you can create alerts. Like, hey, I want to know when something happens. And our alerts can do simple notifications, send emails, things like that, send text messages. But the alerts can also respond and help remediate that. And I'll make a really big statement here. Whenever an alert is triggered, you can do anything within your mindset to solve that problem. And yeah, I use the word anything because when we have alerts, not only can we run scripts, that's one of the things that we do, that's one of the actions we can take. We can also leverage Azure Functions, which is our compute, our PaaS side of the house, our serverless functions to do things. We can even leverage our logic apps. We can even set webhooks out to talk to other services. So it may not be easy to solve the problem, but we have the mechanisms in place that when those actions take place, guess what? We can solve them in whatever creative way we can think of. So Monitor, I could spend all day on this slide. There's just a truckload of information, but understand what feeds Security Center, what feeds Sentinel, the stuff that comes out of Azure Monitor. The only difference is Security Center and Sentinel is just looking for the security-related information coming out of that tool. The last thing here as we kind of land this last module is cost optimization. Really, when we start talking about this, and we talked about this through module 1 and I think even module 3, use things like reserve instances, leverage the hybrid use benefit. You have licenses on-prem, you can bring them into the cloud. Leverage elasticity. You think about this, if you have a seasonality in your business, like you might have an online retailer and Cyber Monday, we need 100 more servers because people are going to want whatever the newest thing is. Well, on-prem, you restrict those 100 servers. In the cloud, scale to that server, scale out. And when that seasonality ends, scale back in, only pay for what you use. There's cost savings in that methodology because whenever I talk to people about cloud and scale, I oftentimes will throw people a bit and I'll say, cloud's not scalable. And they look at me like, what? The cloud is elastic. What is elasticity? Dynamic scalability. So I back into it because I want to make sure they understand that we're not just scalable, we're dynamically scalable. We can scale up, we can scale out, we can scale in, we can scale up, we can scale down, we can scale out, and we can scale in. Look at the designs. Choose the right storage locations. Use what are things called spot VMs, which are temporary VMs for your workloads. The interesting thing about spot VMs is that Microsoft, and by the way, this is all in the language when you configure them, says, hey, we reserve the right. If we need capacity for something else we're doing in Azure, we can take away the spot VMs and evict them. But they come at a much, much discounted price. So use spot VMs to save money. Use the content delivery network if you're going to push a lot of data to multiple regions around the world. We have many, many customers, especially customers that deal with video services, pictures, and those types of things. They use CDN under the covers to publish that data. One case study you can look up with the Rio Olympics, NBC Sports chose Azure as the backbone for that. And they used the content delivery network to take all those events that were happening in Rio and distribute them around the world to the different regions so their customers could watch events seamlessly. Now, I will also say hats off to NBC Sports because they did a lot of things on the app to make the experience very robust. And I think they broke streaming records. A really good case study. But if you Google it using Bing, look at NBC Sports in Azure, you'll find a really good case study that talks about how they use CDN to solve that problem. Use managed services. Whenever we talk about migration, and we started with IaaS migration, we started with lift and shift as we looked at module 2 and moving those compute services. That's not the end of the journey, folks. Most likely, if you're really looking at cost optimization, you're going to look at what are the next steps to move whatever app is on that server that you just moved into the cloud to a pure Azure PaaS service, so you can eliminate the need for that actual virtual machine and managing that OS. So this is a journey, folks. You're thinking about reevaluating this. And even if you don't move things, you still need to reevaluate things. Why? Because Azure is changing so fast. Cloud technologies are changing so fast. What might be true now, 6 months from now, might be a completely different services that can make it even more cost efficient and more faster for your environments, and a lot of those things for you to use. We have a couple tools to help you with this that are built in. We have a cost management tool to help you understand where your costs are coming from inside of Azure. But more importantly, we have a tool called Azure Advisor. This is a free tool that just looks at your environment. It doesn't look at everything. It has a set of rules that it looks at, but it looks quite a few things. For example, one of the things that Azure Advisor will do, it says, hey, look, you have an unused public IP address. Nobody's using that IP address. If you get rid of it, you can save this much money a month. Or you have a VM, and that VM is running at 10% utilization. Have you thought about changing the instance size of that VM and reduce the size of the VM, which will save you money as well? And it'll give you estimates of what that cost savings will be. But it's going to help you understand what's happening in your environment. Advisor is a free tool to work through that information. And here's the cool thing. Both Cost Management and Azure Advisor, they pull all their information from Azure Monitor. They pull it from those logs and the metrics to help us make those smart decisions inside of our environments. So when we look at all of this, and when we look at managing and optimizing, we started that journey today in this module, in our last module of this course, with Azure Active Directory, the authentication. Why? Because once we're in the cloud and we have resources in the cloud, you want to rethink how you're authenticating. You don't want to go back on-prem if you can avoid it. Leverage Azure Active Directory when you talk about those mechanisms there. And then we finish just with a really high-level discussion on the different tools from Security Center, Sentinel, Monitor, Advisor, cost optimization strategies at a real high level to understand that even though we started our journey with Module 1 talking about planning the cloud adoption framework, and we moved all the way from assessment to discovery to migration, that last step is optimization. And that's a really big step, folks, because it's continual. It's not something hey, I just optimized it, I'm done. Out. Nope. You're going to optimize it and you're going to do it again. So that brings us to the end of Module 5. This concludes our Microsoft Azure Virtual Training Day, Migrating On-Premises, Infrastructure and Data. Now, let's take a look at all the great stuff. We started the conversation with Module 1, and you heard it through all the modules. You heard the plan word. We talked about plan, plan, plan. Everything that we do prior to those tools is actually all about getting the environment planned and ready to go. The tools are relatively straightforward to use. They're straightforward because we're feeding that information from the plan. So we talked about in Module 1 the importance of developing that plan, the importance of assessing that information, the importance of understanding how Azure Migrate can help you. And then we moved into Module 2 and we covered how to move virtual machines and some of those compute services. And we talked a little about how to move that information in. And in some cases, you may not move the server. You may just move the file services. You may just move some of the apps into that environment. We talked about that. And in modules 3 and 4, we really talked about how to migrate our databases. And we focused on SQL Server and the different landing zones, whether it's SQL inside of a VM, whether it's a managed instance of Azure SQL, or whether it's Azure SQL in general. We talked about how to move that different environments into our landing zones. And we talked the importance about creating that proper place to put your data inside of it. And then we finished with Module 5, where we talked about some of the other migration considerations, and we really spent a great part of that Module 5 talking about Azure Active Directory and how important that is to integrate with your on-prem domain services with Azure Active Directory. So over these last two parts, we really kind of gave you a nice overview of what those different migration plans can look like, and we really focused on the cloud adoption framework. And when it's time to get started with your migration, remember that one word that we heard in every part: plan. Set your plan. Get it ready to go. Because if you set that plan and have that plan properly set up, folks, your migrations are going to be successful, and that's what I want for you.